What happens when outrage becomes the most powerful form of storytelling? Hi there, I'm Chris with a K, and welcome back to This Week in Queer History, where we celebrate queer moments and icons that I wish I had known about as a young gay kid growing up in conservative America. Today, we're diving into how two fierce groups of activists, GLAAD and ACT UP, transformed not only how the world saw queer people, but how we saw ourselves. They didn't just fight back against hate, they rewrote the script, literally. This is the story of how protest met primetime, how outrage met opportunity, and how the fight for our lives became a revolution on TV.
This week in queer history, stories told with love and glee.
Before GLAAD and ACT UP existed, television and newspapers were bleak territory for queer people. If you were gay on screen in the 1970s or the early 80s, odds were you were the punchline of a joke, the predator, or the mentally ill patient. In newsrooms, editors were calling AIDS the gay plague. The New York Post splashed homophobic headlines across front pages while families watched their sons, brothers, and lovers die, often in silence. The media wasn't just failing to tell the truth, it was actively helping people look away. But if there's one thing queers are good at, it's turning pain into power. And in November 1985, a small group of New Yorkers decided enough was enough. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, was born out of fury and brilliance. Film scholar Vito Russo, translator Gregory Kolovakos, writer Jewel Gomez, and a circle of artists, critics, and activists met to fight back against the lies being printed about AIDS and the queer community. Their first protest targeted the New York Post for its sensational coverage. Activists stood outside its office with signs that read, "Fight AIDS, not gays." This wasn't just about the headlines, it was about survival. When people are misrepresented, they are misunderstood. And when they're misunderstood, their suffering becomes invisible. GLAAD's early members understood that the most powerful battleground wasn't only in Congress or the streets, it was in the stories being told to the public every night at 6 o'clock. So they became media watchdogs, calling out slurs in the scripts, demanding corrections in print, and holding networks accountable for every word that shaped how America viewed queer lives. And they won some quick victories. In 1987, after meeting with GLAAD, the New York Times made historic changes to its editorial policy. It would start using the word gay instead of harsher clinical terms for homosexuality. That small shift in language carried an enormous message. Words matter. From there, GLAAD expanded rapidly. Chapters opened in Los Angeles, San Francisco, pulling the fight directly into the entertainment industry's backyard. The group's goal wasn't censorship, it was fairness. Representation wasn't about forcing people to agree, it was about asking them to see. Meanwhile, another kind of revolution was taking shape just 2 years later. The AIDS crisis had gone from whispered fear to public catastrophe. By 1987, more than 40,000 Americans had died. The government was silent. Pharmaceutical companies were slow, and the media coverage was cruel. And in that silence, grief became gasoline. On March 12, 1987, playwright Larry Kramer took to the stage at the Lesbian and Gay Community Service Center in New York City. His speech was raw, furious, and impossible to ignore. Out of that meeting came ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a direct action movement determined to make the world listen. Their slogan was as stark as their mission: silence equals death. ACT UP didn't politely ask for change, they demanded it. Through marches, die-ins, and theatrical protests that forced America to confront what it was trying to ignore. In April 1987, they held a dramatic protest at the New York City General Post Office, which was timed exactly with tax day, calling out the government for spending billions on war while letting people with AIDS die. Hundreds were arrested. The footage spread worldwide. For the first time, queer grief was visible on the evening news, not as a tragedy, but as resistance. And here's where the stories start to intertwine. GLAAD and ACT UP were two sides of the same coin. One was rewriting narratives, and the other was forcing them onto the airwaves. When ACT UP chained themselves to the doors of the FDA or flooded St. Patrick's Cathedral to protest the church's role in AIDS stigma, GLAAD made sure the cameras told the truth about why they were there. They issued press releases, trained spokespeople, and coached reporters on how not to sensationalize queer suffering. They turned protest into public education, and that partnership between activism and media changed everything. By the late 1980s, GLAAD was ready to move from watchdog to collaborator. They understood that if the media could create stereotypes, it could also create empathy. In 1989, GLAAD launched the first GLAAD Media Awards, an annual celebration of TV shows, films, and journalists who portrayed queer people with fairness and respect. The first ceremony was small, but its message was monumental. Queer stories are worth honoring. Soon, GLAAD wasn't just protesting networks, it was partnering with them. By 1992, Entertainment Weekly had named GLAAD one of Hollywood's most powerful entities. Their influence was reshaping primetime. Then came the moments that truly changed television forever. It's hard to imagine now, but in 1994, a same-sex kiss on TV was national news. When ABC's Roseanne planned an episode featuring a lesbian kiss, conservative groups lost their minds. Boycotts were threatened, advertisers pulled out, and executives panicked. But GLAAD stepped in, lobbying advertisers, rallying public support, and assuring ABC that America was ready to see two women kiss without the world ending. The episode aired as planned. And it did what queer kisses often do. It terrified some people, thrilled others, and made visibility impossible to ignore. 3 years later came a moment that defined television history. GLAAD launched a campaign called Let Ellen Out, pressuring ABC to let the lead character on Ellen, played by Ellen DeGeneres, come out on the show. On April 30th, 1997, Ellen Morgan said the words that rippled through the country, "I'm gay." 42 million people watched. It was funny, awkward, heartfelt, and revolutionary. That single episode won an Emmy, a Peabody, and a place in history. It also triggered a conservative backlash so intense that ABC began adding parental advisories to episodes featuring queer content. But President Obama would later say, Ellen's coming out pushed our country in the direction of justice. For GLAAD, it was proof that public pressure could transform pop culture, and pop culture could transform hearts. Then came Will and Grace. When it premiered on NBC in 1998, it was the first mainstream sitcom with two gay lead characters, Will, the charming lawyer, and Jack, his flamboyant best friend. GLAAD immediately praised the show, celebrating its humor and its humanity. It wasn't just about being funny, it was about being seen as whole. For millions of viewers, Will and Grace made queerness normal, not tragic, not exotic, just life. At its peak, the show reached over 14 million viewers per week. It won multiple Emmy Awards and ran for 8 seasons. As GLAAD's president Sarah Kate Ellis later said, to have one of the major networks airing a show like this in prime time sent a message to the country that LGBTQ stories are valid, important, and worth telling. From Roseanne's kiss to Ellen's confession to Will and Grace's laughter, each milestone was built on the outrage and organization that GLAAD and ACT UP had sparked years earlier. While GLAAD was transforming Hollywood, ACT UP was still transforming healthcare and saving lives. They occupied FDA headquarters, demanding faster drug approvals. They stormed the NIH, demanding clinical trials including women and people of color. They plastered silence equals death posters on city walls until the world couldn't look away. Their protests led to real change. They accelerated FDA approval for HIV medications. They expanded access to experimental drugs, and it increased funding for AIDS research. And perhaps just as important, they taught a generation how to demand visibility. You can draw a straight line, and a very gay straight line, from ACT UP's media-savvy protests to GLAAD's red carpet advocacy. Both understood the same thing: attention is power. If you control how people see you, you can start to change how they treat you. By the early 2000s, representation was improving, but the fight was far from over. Shows like Queer as Folk and The L Word explored gay and lesbian life in ways that felt raw and real, but they were mostly confined to cable. And GLAAD kept pushing, expanding its monitoring to new platforms and advocating for stories that reflected the full spectrum of queer life. In 2013, the organization officially dropped the words Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation from its name. From then on, it was simply GLAAD, a recognition that the community had evolved far beyond just those two letters. Now it fought for trans visibility, bisexual representation, and stories that reached every intersection of identity. And as the streamers took off, queer storytelling exploded. Netflix's Orange is the New Black in 2013 showcased a diverse group of lesbian and trans women. Amazon's Transparent in 2014 brought trans narratives into mainstream awards season. FX's Pose in 2018 broke every record with the largest transgender cast ever assembled for a scripted show. Each of these moments was built on decades of advocacy. Proof, when activists changed the airwaves, they changed the world. Under Sarah Kate Ellis's leadership since 2014, GLAAD has become both a media partner and a watchdog. Its annual Where We Are on TV report tracks the number of LGBTQ characters across broadcast, cable, and streaming platforms. In recent years, the group has set a public goal: at least 10% of all series regulars on television should be LGBTQ. And that's not only a statistic, it's a vision of a world where queerness is not a special episode, but simply part of the fabric of storytelling. GLAAD also runs initiatives like the Studio Responsibility Index, which grades Hollywood studios on LGBTQ inclusion in film, and Spirit Day, an annual campaign encouraging millions to wear purple to stand against bullying. And in 2023, GLAAD received the Emmy Governor's Award for its decade-long impact on media and advocacy. When GLAAD began in 1985, queer representation was something to fight for. Today, it's something to measure, critique, and celebrate. When ACT UP marched in the streets of New York City, they were fighting for survival. Today, their slogans echo through digital activism, mutual aid groups, and community care networks that owe their spirit to those early fighters. But both organizations remind us that visibility isn't victory, it's vigilance. Because even as queer stories fill our screens, new waves of backlash are coming at us. Book bans, anti-trans legislation, and online hate campaigns show us how fragile progress can be. Yet the lesson from GLAAD and ACT UP is this: visibility without action is decoration. Action without visibility is silence. We need both. Frustration is just passion with nowhere to go. It bubbles up, quiet at first, until it can't be contained anymore. And when you finally meet someone who feels the same fire, boom, that's when the world starts to change. That's what I imagine it felt like for those first members of ACT UP and GLAAD. They were just ordinary people, fed up, done with being invisible. And they took their anger and they turned it into action, their grief into strategy, and their outrage into power. They didn't wait for permission to be heard. They demanded it. They made themselves impossible to ignore. And I'm thinking about that a lot right now because right now it feels like we've been coasting. We won some ground over the last years, but now I think we've gotten comfortable. And equality, it isn't a finish line. It's a constant dance. And when the rhythm changes, we have to move with it. Today, the fight looks so different than it did before. And it's not just about headlines or talk shows. It's all about algorithms and our social media feeds. It's in the quiet spaces that decide who gets to be seen. So maybe the question isn't if we fight, it's how do we fight? And how do we stage digital sit-ins in this world now? How do we flood the internet with truth and joy so it breaks through all of the noise? How do we show up when the gates are made of code instead of concrete? And I don't have all the answers, but I do know where they will come from. Us. Because every major change in queer history began the same way. Someone got angry, and someone else said, "Me too," and Suddenly, it wasn't just a spark, it was a movement. That's our queer superpower, turning frustration into creativity, pain into progress, and isolation into connection. Because when we find each other and when we come together, we don't just demand to be seen. We remind the world how powerful love in motion can be. If you enjoyed this episode, please share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how these stories of queer resistance inspire you and impact you, and any moments that you've had in your life that inspire you. You can always check out this video popping up right over here. It's more queer history, so please check it out. And also you can go to myqueerbirthday.com, where you can find other icons and events that happen on your birthday. The link is down in the description below. Until next time, stay strong, stay bold, and keep making history.